Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Big Debate 1. Welcome to the World Cancer Congress, held first time here in Malaysia. We're very proud to be the first country to host this event in Southeast Asia. I am Meera Sivasothy. I am a radio host at a sassy radio station here in Kuala Lumpur called BFM 89.9. And I present the Health and Living show every weekday from 4 p.m. to 5 p.m. I will be the moderator over the next 3 days, over the next 3 debates, debate 1, 2, and 3, today being Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. Today's first debate is titled Cancer Societies Can Engage with the Pharmaceutical Industry Without Compromising Their Independence. Just some house rules, and would like you to participate in a little bit of a a poll. Now, if you go to your app at the moment, can you go into your app? We'd like to do a quick poll as to whether or not you're for or against this debate today. If you go to live polling, go into debate 1, and just click whether you agree or disagree.
I think we should go home now, Richard.
Oh.
How's that going?
Dear, oh dear. What's going on?
You're going to have it difficult, Richard.
Yeah, well, oh, no, it's changing.
It is?
Oh, you see, it's the stalking horses. Here they come. Here they come. Come on. Come on.
It's like a live opinion poll.
I've provided a lot of money out there in the audience. I'm very disappointed.
Just give you another minute to do that. Anyone else? Go to your app, live polling.
If you think this is anonymous, it's not.
Tap on. Don't believe him, believe me. I'm in control. Debate 1, do you agree or disagree? Oh.
That's reasonably balanced.
It's not. It's going down.
Within statistical significance.
Oh, that's better. Come on. It's all right.
Richard, I think that's what you need to win a US election, so you should be fine.
We will ask you to vote again after the session to see whether you've changed your mind or not. So that's what, 30, are we done? About 38%, 62%. All right, we're going to run with our debate today. Debating for the topic today is Subhanu Saxena, Regional Director from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and co-managing partner at the New Rhine Healthcare US. Welcome, Subhanu. How are you today?
Very well, thank you.
Yeah. And debating against Professor Richard Sullivan, Director of Institute of Cancer Policy, King's College in London. Ladies and gentlemen, a huge hand for them. Each debater is going to be given 10 minutes each to present his arguments, after which we'll open up the floor for 20 minutes so you can get involved and ask them questions as well. And then we go into a 5-minute each for them to wrap up their arguments. And we're done with our 60-minute debate today. So I'm going to actually hand over to Subhanu Saxena to actually debate this topic. Cancer societies can engage with the pharmaceutical industry without compromising their independence. The floor over to you, Subhanu.
Thank you so much, Meera. Friends, good afternoon. It's a real privilege and pleasure to be here at this debate against my esteemed colleague, Richard, who I have much admiration and respect for. But I'm afraid I'm going to have to defeat you today, Richard. Because I think the only answer you can give is a resounding yes to the question. But I'd like to share with you some key arguments why. So there are 3 sections to my argument. First, the case for collaboration. The second, some examples of great collaborations where that independence has been maintained. And then finally, I'd like to leave you all with a call to action. And the model that I want to give you and the overall message is the power of partnerships to transform society for the good. We mustn't lose that, whatever the outcome of the debate. The world is too complex for one actor to have all the answers. We need partnerships, and that's the way forward. And those who've looked at my career know there are a few things I've always stood for. One is that innovation and access are not either or, they're and. And the second is the power of partnerships to make a huge difference. And the model I want to leave you with is that of a choir, where each member of the choir has their own distinct voice. But when they come together in harmony, that's when you have great music. So what's the case for partnership? The first thing I would want to share with you is we live in a world of doom and gloom, and the people tend to focus a lot on the negatives. But we must never forget we have a lot of reason to be optimistic that we are making the world healthier. It's often said at the Gates Foundation we call impatient optimists, but there's a lot of evidence for that. Those of you who've read the book by the late, great Hans Rosling, Factfulness, will see the statistics in a very clear light. And some examples, since 1990, HIV child mortality has halved, and HIV is no longer a death sentence. Neglected tropical diseases affecting 1 billion people are no longer seen as just neglected. There are many other examples in the world of cancer in particular, and I'm sure has been mentioned already, but we're here when the Nobel Prize was issued today for some amazing advancements in the field of cancer. There's still much to do, so being an optimist doesn't mean you shouldn't be a realist. You know, there's still over 5 million children under the age of 5 who are dying every year. We can't let that go on. But the reason we've made such progress, there are two. One is that we kept innovating, and we kept innovating through partnerships that were able to make it happen. And why is that? Well, we don't need to tell the audience that biology is complex, and so we don't know where the next innovation will come from. So we have to foster innovative collaborations to crack the problems of today. I'll give you a few examples. If you look at the field of immuno-oncology, what's increasingly becoming clear is that the more we understand the immune system, it'll help us to fight infection. And we know the root cause of many cancers come from infection. So the Wall Street Journal had this article a few months ago about how the HIV virus genetic machinery can be a tool to modify T cells and attack cancers. So Bill Gates has this vision that one day we'll have a headline that cancer tools are helping us cure HIV. And at the foundation, we've invested in companies like Immunocare, CureVac, and Moderna to leverage the work they've done on T cells to stimulate the immune system, first in cancer, but maybe in infectious diseases, and also to develop new vaccines. So just some examples of how partnerships in one area can have a profound impact in others. And that's why partnerships are so important. So I think we should just take it as given that, and not up for debate, that partnerships and collaborations is the way to make a profound difference to the patients we wish to serve. The question that was raised here is, can cancer societies work with companies and not compromise their independence? And I feel sorry for Richard, almost the way the question is phrased. You just need one example, and then the answer has to be yes. Unfortunately, we have many examples. So let me share with you some. I had the privilege, I shared some examples at the Gates Foundation. I had the privilege of leading Cipla as the global CEO and managing director for a number of years. And there we had numbers of partnerships with various cancer organizations, patient societies in India, and I can tell you, their independent voice made our plans better. And the best partnerships were ones where we got candid, clear feedback, a dose of reality, I may say, as to what really was needed on the ground. You may have read earlier this year, end of last year, Cipla came together with the American Cancer Society in Chai to bring low-cost cancer drugs to Africa. Some are selling at 50 cents and infusions down to $10. So these partnerships can also drive affordability and accessibility. And I can tell you, the Cancer Society, the real value there from the ACS was being very clear and strident as to what the needs of patients were on the ground. And so really, the best partnerships are there when people maintain their voice and come together for a greater good. And I'll come back to that in a second. I think a couple of other examples I would just give you is I had also worked with Gilead on creating a framework to bring low-cost hepatitis C drugs to Africa and emerging markets. And the work we did with many hepatitis patient organizations and groups, again, to make sure we really met the real needs on the ground and understood what the real barriers were, allowed us to really make a huge difference. The year before these products were launched in India, only 10,000 patients had access to hepatitis C treatment. In our first year alone, we reached 10,000 patients, and over 50,000 patients have access to these medicines. So the power of partnerships done well with the right actors is phenomenal. And I think if we look at, again, the reason I said, it's the value of bringing different perspectives. I got a great learning when I joined the pharma industry by my boss, Thomas Abeling. He would call me Swami as a term of endearment. I have a dark side. I'm a teacher of Sanskrit outside of my work. And he said, Swami, before taking a decision, speak to 5 people. And what he meant by that was the issues are so complex, the 5th person will always add value. And I've seen that in collaborations and partnerships. Everyone has something to bring to make the plans better. And when that works, you get really powerful results and powerful solutions for patients. And it's that diversity of thought, I would argue, is what drives innovation. So not only I know it happens, I've been personally involved, but it's an imperative. We must never let that go. So the question is, what really makes partnership successful? I think there are 3 things. One is leadership. And there I spent a lot of time working with groups, cultivating leaders that can lead organizations with purpose beyond profit. So what's becoming increasingly clear is organizations that think beyond the numbers, drive better engagement of their employees, are able to make more balanced decisions, and put partnerships in the right context. But I think there's still a crying need for leaders that operate that way. And it's something that with some of my colleagues, we've spent some time thinking, how do we create leaders that can lead organizations with that greater purpose than just the numbers? The second is that we're all aligned around one transcendent goal. And what is that? Well, Melinda talks a lot about, Melinda Gates, who's our boss in an organization? And we come back to that patient, that 5-year-old in Africa, or someone suffering from cancer. They're our real boss. So what really binds partnerships together when you come with your independent voices is, are we making a difference to the patient we're trying to serve? And we must never lose that in any collaboration. The third, I would say, is strong independent governance. And I'm quite surprised how often in many agreements, not enough time is spent on governance to make sure each side has the say they need. So we have a proper way of having debate. In the investments we make at Neurine Healthcare, 2 things. First, our investment model is to invest alongside founders, not on top of them. And 2, we spend a lot of time on the governance model to make sure the right people with the right skills are able to make the casting vote on key decisions.
You have 30 seconds, Subhanu.
So the final point is actually, those are what would make a great collaboration. I think the call to action is the following. The doors are open for these kinds of partnerships. Dr. Tedros recently said to industry leaders, let's find new ways of collaborating, and let's do it remembering who we serve. So I'll close with a quote from Mahatma Gandhi on his birthday, where he said that the best way to find yourself is to lose yourself in the service of others, and that's what all of us can bring to everything we do, is not forget the patients that we serve. Thank you very much.
Said like a true Swami. Thank you very much, Subhanu. Debating against the topic, cancer societies should not engage with pharmaceutical industries without compromising their independence. Professor Richard Sullivan. Richard?
Wonderful. Thank you so much. There is much I agree with you on, but let me disagree. Let me start by telling you a little story. It's a bit of Sufi mythology. And the Sufi mythology is this. There's this frog and this scorpion on the banks of the Nile. And they spend the days chatting about life to each other. And one day the scorpion says to the frog, would you mind giving me a lift across to the other side? And the frog says, "You've got to be joking. You know, you're a scorpion. You're going to sting me." And the scorpion says, "No, no, no, it's ridiculous. If I sting you, you'll drown and I'll drown. We'll both die. Why would I do that?" And the frog thinks, that's logical. Halfway across the Nile, the scorpion stings the frog. And as they're both drowning, the frog says to the scorpion, "Why on earth did you do that? We're going to drown now." And the scorpion says, "I'm so, so sorry. It was just in my nature." So, can you guess which is the Cancer Society and which is the Pharmaceutical Society? So
It's
so
a
this
trick
is
question.
your problem. This is your problem here. Look, the pharmaceutical industry is there to make money for its stakeholders. And I'm going to say there's nothing wrong with that. That is business. That is what we've set this thing up to do, okay? Being against this motion is actually not a critique of the model of the pharmaceutical industry. Actually, it's one of the most successful and profitable enterprises in commercial histories, worth over $1 trillion a year now. Business is one thing. Health and cancer care is not a business. It's a human right and a fundamental public good. And I realize I do sound like a rabid socialist now, but I am a rabid socialist when it comes to health. The evidence is overwhelming that in a free market approach to cancer kills patients and it financially ruins them. And indeed, if the destruction of so many countries' public health systems by the neoliberal economic orders has taught us anything else, is that what we need out there is cancer societies to be, as Dr. Princess Nono said yesterday, to be brave. And they need to be brave to challenge corruption, clinical, commercial, and political failure that plague so many of the countries around the world. And we all know this. So the reason you should reject this notion is actually because you are advocates for cancer patients, not the servants of the pharmaceutical industry. And let me unpack this a little bit more. There's actually a fair amount of good research actually on the morality and ethics of business, in particular the pharmaceutical industry, published in an amazing journal called the Journal of Business Ethics. Please don't subscribe to this, okay? If you want to just fall asleep, if you want to never be invited to another dinner party again, feel free to actually read this journal. But by and large, it's really quite turgid. But what it's very clear on is the business ethics of the pharmaceutical model is minimalist, it's utilitarian, and it's quite situational. In other words, it's about self-interest. And this is what drives behaviors and social contracts. So if pharmas were social altruism, we wouldn't have many of the problems we do today about affordability, about value, about evergreening, about all the issues you'll all be very well aware of. When industry gives you money, and I'm pointing at all of you here, they're not doing it to express their gratitude, appreciation, and love for you. This is not altruism. There is an expectation at some point that you will do something for them. So it influences behavior, and even if you don't realize it, this is unconscious bias. So I'm afraid it's too easy for cancer societies, frankly, to be unwilling or unwitting instruments of promotion, protection, subversion of what patients really, really need. And I agree with you about leadership. Absolutely right. But leadership has to be independent in all its guises. And indeed, if you're not careful, actually, the funding of cancer societies can be actually commercial coercion at its most extreme. Are we aligned, really? Well, I don't know. How can you be objective, unbiased if you take money from the private sector? You please your paymasters. And why do you please your paymasters? Because if you don't, at some point, that fear in the back of your mind is you're going to lose that money and you are going to cease to exist. And it will always be there. You unwittingly do things that you promote immuno-oncology when there's no basic chemotherapy. You tell the world that what we need is more proton beam, when actually what we need is just more radiotherapy per se. The fundamental failure to improve outcomes in most countries is not a lack of technology, access to immunotherapy, or indeed innovative private sector investment. It's political failure to fund public health expenditure, to ruthlessly neutralize corruption, and to regulate the quality of care. Being funded by pharmaceutical industry, I would hazard to you, is actually closing down your vision of what you have to do as cancer societies for the good of society. But I want to end on a hopeful note here, and this is where I'm going to come into agreement with you. The problem here, as we're talking about, is money. Cancer societies can't exist on fresh air. And actually, I'm going to argue that a lot of cancer societies, the problem with their representation is they require mostly liberal, I'm going to say white, upper middle class people to do this because it's expensive. You have to give up a lot of your time. So how do you get these organizations funded? So here's an outlandish idea. I'm not just going to critique this debate, this motion. I'm going to give you a solution to it. Look, why don't we start making cancer societies and patient advocates co-PIs on clinical trial grants? Pay them for their ability to engage with the clinical studies we do. We don't do this sort of thing. That would immediately wildly open up the funding into patient advocacy and into the clinical societies. We spend an enormous amount of money from the federal funds, from philanthropic funds into research, huge amounts. And yet we give a tiny proportion to patient organizations and cancer societies as a percentage of that. And the estimates are less than about 2%. I mean, that is absolutely outrageous. So why on earth is there not a way of putting money into these societies and actually properly supporting them in a way which means they would not have to scrabble around looking for pharmaceutical or private sector funding? The power of partnerships and collaborations is absolutely essential. But these need to be partnerships and collaborations which are independent. And indeed, the diversity of thought needs to be independent. Otherwise, your thoughts won't be. And that's absolutely true, and I will show you afterwards. I had exactly the same Gandhi quote. Thank you. I absolutely, I thought, there's no
The great
way
man
he's
speak
going
to us
use
after
this.
150 years.
I really, this is literally my last sentence, absolutely incredible. I really said, as cancer societies, you're there to serve patients, not the pharmaceutical industry. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard. Didn't realize Richard was a closet Swami. Had no idea, Richard. Okay, question for you. Understanding a patient's journey to find a solution beyond just developing a cure. How do we do that without this collaboration, Richard? And if patient centricity is what, is going to drive this fight against cancer, or management of cancer, then what happens?
I'm not against partnerships and collaborations with the pharmaceutical industry. But my argument is that cancer society, and this is the question you have in front of you, is about the receiving money and the compromising. And a patient's journey here is more than, this says pharmaceutical industry, medicines. A patient's journey is well beyond medicines. I'm not arguing against the importance of pharmaceuticals. Child who has ALL, rituximab, immuno-oncology. I'm just making the point here that in a patient journey, pharmaceuticals is a very, very small cog. The social and political determinants of that patient's journey, surgery and radiotherapy, pathology, imaging, survivorship, palliative care, all of these, and they're all equally as important. And that's my argument with this.
Subhanu, you want to say something to that?
A couple of things I would say. First, we shouldn't conflate arguments around political failures with the question at hand. Many of the issues you raise, Richard, are absolutely real, but they're irrelevant for this discussion. They need to be addressed, and there's work we do at the foundation to help create the right ecosystems for better decision making. And I think if we come to the question at hand, I would submit that we should abandon some cynical notions that are out there. Three of them in particular. The first is that we are the Scorpions. By the way, the German band Scorpions are one of my favorite rock bands, I have to tell you, but we saw them in June. But my experience is the tens of thousands of professionals and scientists I work with in the pharmaceutical industry are not closet kind of conspirators to take over the world. They show up and they come to work to make the world a better place. And you're right, business is business. The world is not a charity, but there are ways how we can make business work together for good. I led a company, Cipla, whose mission was given to us by Mahatma Gandhi. People came to work saying, we're doing Gandhi's work. These companies exist. These leaders exist. It's up to us to foster them. And it's one of the things we try and do with the investments at New Rhine and also at the Gates Foundation. And this idea that business success is incompatible with social impact is one of the biggest fallacies I've come across. And the more we repeat it, the less we give those companies that want to do it a chance to flourish. And this notion that money drives or compromise your values. Well, if it doesn't come from the pharma industry, it'll come from somewhere else, so you're not beholden to them. I've had the privilege of working with many organizations we funded, and I tell you, the leaders of those organizations will not do something just because we fund them. So I think we need to give, people more credit that they really can come together and focus on that message of serving.
Ladies and gentlemen, opening up the floor for questions. Anyone got a question? Yes.
Thank you. Thank you both. Very interesting. Ani Purushottam, King's College London, sits next door to Richard, so you might think I'm naturally on his side. And there's a bit of a surprise. You've both focused your entire arguments around funding. My question for both of you is, and I don't see funding in that question there, can cancer societies engage with the pharmaceutical industry in many ways without compromising their independence?
So the short answer to that is yes, but the wording, you're absolutely right, it's the value, it's the loaded term of the word engage. Because, we're in violent agreement that you can engage as long as you are independent. But if engagement means funding and being supported by them,
but it
then
doesn't
the answer
say that
is
in
no.
the question.
No.
So why did you assume it was funding?
Well, we assumed it was funding because that's one of the most critical areas for cancer societies. They're heavily funded, and that's part of the engagement piece.
I can give you a good example where engagement without funding is important and that independence is important. That's when we try and design better treatment guidelines and protocols, where I think we want the best scientists to come together and figure out how do we create the right patient journeys. In many of the countries that we're talking about, the care pathways are not well understood. And if there are, there's still many barriers. And so there is huge scope for engagement. I think of some of the work we've done with CHAI and others organizations. A lot of it's about engaging just to figure out the right treatment pathway. So there's plenty of scope for broader engagement, and where actually that independence is actually mandatory.
Thank you.
What about transparency, Subhanu? Just as it would be for political donations, for an example, how do you manage that?
Well, I think we shouldn't be shy of when organizations receive funding, that we should be open about it. Those of you who've been to medical conferences, many opinion leaders put a slide up as to who they're funded by. Now, does that taint your view on what they say? Well, I think you look at the credibility of the opinion leader and their scientific accomplishments. So absolutely, we should embrace transparency.
Any other question?
Up here.
Yep, go ahead.
I'm Verna Lavender. I am the treasurer of the UK Oncology Nursing Society, and as a charity we're primarily funded by sponsorship from pharma companies. And I think it is about how you engage with pharmaceutical companies. I can tell you that we've got very strong leadership on our board, and our charity's purpose is to provide education that is free to cancer nurses to ensure better outcomes and experiences for people who have cancer and are receiving treatment for cancer. And so we work in partnership to make sure that the education that's provided free to our nursing workforce, which is supported by pharmaceutical companies, is about improving patient outcomes and patient experiences. And in terms of disclosure, I have to write the annual report, which goes in the UK on the Company House public website. I have to make public disclosures through the pharmaceutical industry compliance annually, and have to declare exactly what money we've received and how we've used that, and have to account for that, and with complete transparency, so we can be credible. But I can tell you that the board, what we do and what we provide as a charity is about our charity purpose and our charity mission. It just happens that to support that, we receive our funding from a pharmaceutical industry. And without having that, we couldn't deliver that education. And it's a two-way dialogue, because it does inform the pharmaceutical industry about what they need to think about, factoring in how the workforce needs to be educated when they develop new drugs and bring them to market.
Thank you.
So I'm definitely in favour for this motion.
Sure. Thank you. Richard?
Yeah, so I don't want to argue that there's not very good models out there where there's tremendous transparency, both on both sides. My point really is that for every person and any organisation that stands up and says we're fantastically transparent, there is an awful lot where there is no transparency, and it's done as a matter of course. And I'm sure everyone in this room knows about the sort of current lack of transparency, for instance, on the clinical side. I mentioned the New York Times recently. And you're right, this is a problem here about transparency and funding. And in true independence, where you're given your money and it's an unrestricted grant for you to operate, and you're completely transparent against that money, that's absolutely great, fantastic. And there are plenty of models of that, as Arnie said. But there is plenty for which that's not true. And there's a vast amount of work out there, both in I would say, the journalistic literature and the non-journalistic literature demonstrating that.
But you can do that partnership engagement.
You can,
without
and I don't.
compromising independence.
Yeah,
You can
but I'm
do
just
that.
saying, a good company and a transparent cancer society is not what we're the issue here. But there are plenty of companies which do not operate in that manner, and there are sadly societies all over the world for which there is evidence that they are not operating in that transparent manner.
Perhaps they should model some of those societies that are.
Totally agree.
Subhanu?
So maybe just to build on the comment and build on Richard's point, are we perfect everywhere? Absolutely not. And I think there are a few things that I would share that are happening more and more. First, when you look at internal governance procedures within companies to get such grants approved, things are a lot tighter now. And in fact, the internal compliance functions often pick up if a grant is given to influence a certain decision, and they increasingly are getting stopped in companies with good governance. Second, you made a very good point. I've spent some time on a couple of initiatives recently to help recruit board members for certain organizations. And we look for two things: diversity of thought and background on those boards. So sometimes get someone from a different industry to bring a different perspective. And then the second is, there are ways to build into the statutes of such organizations that no more than X% can come from any single company to drive that independence. And I think to help Richard with his point, I think there is a scope to create models of best practice, and we share them, and we take them to geographies or sectors where that transparency, that governance is not in place. And I think that is a very exciting opportunity, actually.
Gentlemen?
My name's Terry Sullivan. I'm currently with the Public Health Association of Australia, and previous to that I was with the Cancer Council of Western Australia for 24 years. And I've sat on executives that's wrestled with exactly this problem. I've managed programs that's done education for general practitioners, and in the past we have accepted sponsorship for those programs for general practitioners from the pharmaceutical industry, but we moved away from doing so. The reason we did so was the perception of the community to ensure that we as a cancer society were providing independent advice on all matters in relation to cancer. Now, I've observed over probably 30 years strategies of the pharmaceutical industry who support, facilitate, some might suggest capture patient organisations to lead the charge on government funding for the next great drug to advance cancer treatment, regardless of the quality of the evidence, the quantum of the benefit of that new drug, particularly in the context of the relative cost of that new drug. So what I've observed at quite close hand is organisations who effectively become a second-party lobbyist for the pharmaceutical industry to capture public monies to advance their sales, where one might argue on an objective assessment in terms of value for money, that might not be the best investment of public funds. But it's also very important for cancer societies to look every member of their community in the eye, every donor, to say, the advice we provide you when it comes to all matters cancer is based exclusively and solely on the best available evidence. And that's where I firstly confess I wrote the question. So if you don't like the question, blame me. But I've never heard a debate where people didn't argue about the question, so that's great. So after my soliloquy, I want to thank you both for drawing this question out for putting the challenges before us, because we in the cancer control world fight for every dollar we get. And income from the pharmaceutical industry is a very, very tempting source of income for all cancer societies. And I just want to leave with one invitation, and I will come up with a question for you. And the question is, how do we take into account the power balance? Now, my view is the Melinda and Bill Gates Foundation is a powerful player with substantial resources. So it might be in a position to be in a reasonable power relationship with the pharmaceutical industry. My experience is most cancer organisations are not. So I invite you to think about this through the prism of the relative power relationship when it comes to the potential engagement and partnership.
Thank you, Terry. Subhanu?
Thank you, Terry, for giving us this provocative question. Maybe I can make a couple of responses to what you said. I think you said the most important thing is that we should all be accountable to the evidence. And that is the ultimate arbiter. And by being transparent, we can share where the evidence has come from. I'm going to say something that maybe you won't agree with, but I've been increasingly troubled by how organizations and individuals feel they have to act because of what they may be described in the Twitter sphere or in the public domain. And I think that's the route to bad decision making, if we make decisions as to what people would think of us versus what's the right thing to do. And I think you're right, there may well be bad actors out there who are applying for grants under false pretenses, but good governance will screen them out. So I think we mustn't shirk from doing the right thing just because the funding comes from a certain place. I'll give you one concrete example that I've seen firsthand in getting drugs through the UK system for orphan diseases. Often, for that disease, there may be 3 experts that you can go to. And guess what? Most of them have had trials funded by pharmaceutical companies. Complex diseases. But when it comes to the assessment, they're not allowed to attend because they have been funded. So we're the experts who will be able to look at the evidence and say, is this good for patients? So I think the balance is needed. The balance comes with good leadership, good governance, and an ability to limit contributions from one organization to a particular society. But as I said before, luckily we have many examples where that does happen, and we should build on what works and correct what doesn't.
Gentleman over there.
I'm a woman.
Oh, sorry, I can't
that's all
quite
right.
see clearly.
Again, thank you for this really interesting debate. I'm Maureen Rigney with Lung Cancer Alliance. We're a patient advocacy and support organization in Washington, D.C. So I have a few questions that may just to spark perhaps some a conversation. I don't know if it really involves compromising our independence, but I would say I do think it matters the percentage of income that a society receives from pharmaceutical companies. I think that's an issue. We certainly do get a percentage of ours, and we know the companies, we work closely with them. Some of them have little or no expectations of us. Other times people have asked us to do things we weren't comfortable with, and we said no without repercussions. So I would just like to say that. I also think on some level, like these large corporations that are making so much money have some obligation to give back in some way, and we can help with that. And I think it is a struggle. I think that it is possible that we may be perceived to be, making them look good by working with us, but I think it's also possible that maybe we are making them better through working with us. And finally, I think there is the concept that if you have this we have this expertise, and if we give it away, maybe it's not worth as much. And so if we do inform companies about the patient journey, isn't our time worth something as far as that expertise goes? So thank you.
Thank you. Richard?
Yeah, so this comes, and we are going to get back to funding here, because this is what it always comes down to. If companies were putting a percentage of their CSR money into an independent foundation, which was then handed out in a mixed pool, we wouldn't be having this debate here. This is about the point that Morris made about this is capture, and the reality is all the evidence indicates that we are too pharmacentric with a lot of our assessments of systems and our engagement in countries. All the problems come out because of that. It's not that, you know, pharmaceuticals, again, are not important. It's that we do have a tremendous amount, unfortunately, of capture, particularly around medicines and the drive, and we see this in the UK with the Cancer Drugs Fund, drive to actually fund a single form of technology within their overall cancer pathway. And that is understandable from the industry perspective, because that is essentially what they're working on from the pharmaceuticals. But again, if you as an independent patient organisation, you should be independent and should be advocating for all forms of affordable and equitable treatments, not just medicines.
Do you want to come back with something? No?
No, I think a lot of the points have been said.
Sure. One last question before we end it.
Thank you. And I'm sorry, another Australian, so apologies for the Australian dominance. I work for Cancer Council Australia, and I'm sort of an advocate and have been in the role for a long time. I just wanted, and I really admire Subhanu's courage in taking the affirmative on in this environment when we have these positions. I really wanted your take on a real-world example of why me, in my role, I would kind of be out of business if I was seen to be closely involved with the pharmaceutical sector. The most important individual program in cancer control introduced in Australia in the last 25 years by a long way is our National Bowel Cancer Screening Program. It's phenomenal. It's taken us 20 years since randomised controlled trial data showed that it would be viable, lots of things along the way. The net costs of running that program a year, on the current estimates of net costs, and it's going to pay for itself, we could run it 10 times over just by the money that the taxpayers are subsidising for 2 drugs recently put on our pharmaceutical benefit scheme for treating hepatitis C. That's the real world example, and the reason, and I'm not criticising that decision, the decision to subsidise those drugs were because a smaller number of people will die sooner if they don't have it. But we compromise our ability to get these big population level interventions funded because we often feel that consumers are exploited by the sector, and people in public policy get it, economists in government get it. So that's a real world example. It's a difficult conversation to have in media, but I just want your take on that, because that's what we grapple with all the time. That's a real world example.
Sure, no, I'm glad you raised it, and I would say again, I think that is an issue more in the political sphere with regards to the question at hand. And I just want to share with you a challenge that I gave. I was part of the NICE review of the NICE system in the UK a number of years ago. And I made the point that if you really wanted to rank cost effectiveness, don't just look at drugs, look at all interventions. And I think we're still at a nascency in our use of health economics in the right way. And this notion of being able to force rank all health interventions from acute unplanned hospital visits to hip replacements and understand what that looks like in terms of cost effectiveness. I think we do need to go to that. And that unfortunately means we have to make choices. And that's what the politicians are there to do. I think the more we can find self-funding solutions, the better. The role we sometimes play at the Gates Foundation is to step in where markets do fail. So we provide, for example, an instrument called the volume guarantee, where we will backstop purchases of a certain drug so that de-risks the investment for a pharma company. And there are increasingly now tools that will help us find more sustainable financing solutions. So that's maybe a separate topic we can do next time. In how do we build sustainable financing solutions for research and these health interventions? I think there are a lot of things we can talk about. Some challenges, but also some solutions coming.
So very quickly, before we end.
Actually, the elephant in the room is hospitals and healthcare, outlets. Because you will find doctors who recommend certain drugs or certain treatments when they are working with pharmaceutical companies. I have been in this industry for about 11 years. I can give you a few examples of this. I mean, a real example. So yes, Cancer Society will be compromised big time, 100%. Even doctors, even hospitals will be compromised.
Thank you. Subhanu?
While that may happen, there are many examples also where it luckily doesn't happen, and we need to keep building on the cases where that doesn't happen.
Okay, gentlemen, 5 minutes each to wrap up. I'm going to start with Richard.
I want you to think of engagement as funding. I think Arnie's right. If you just talk about this in the kind of, can you hang out with pharma, have a couple of beers, have a chat, you know, discuss a better world for cancer patients, that would be fine. But when we say engagement, what we're really talking about here is money, okay? And I agree with the last gentleman. He talked about cancer societies and clinical objectivity. The issue here is across the board, actually, that we're talking about objectivity and independence and representation as a cancer society of your patients and your community. And for that, it doesn't matter whether you think they have the most transparent governance system in the world. The issue comes down here is true independence and freedom from any form of bias here. And for that, a funding model needs to be found which provides cancer societies with that sort of independence and that freedom to truly represent their community, completely dissociated from, and I would say this, clinical pressures, political pressures, pharmaceutical pressures, any form of externality that's likely to lead to worse outcomes and not serve them. And so that's why, ladies and gentlemen, I urge you, in the spirit of the frog and the scorpion, to vote against this motion.
Thank you, Richard. Over to you.
Thank you. So I think, Richard, all I would say is actually there are many tools available to us to set up good governance, and we do see them in organizations existing today. Are they everywhere they need to be? Are these issues not real? Well, they are real issues, but there are solutions, and there are organizations where this is indeed possible, and we need to encourage those examples and build on those and make them more prevalent. In wrapping up, I would say it's very easy in this day and age just take the negative views the easy way, that we can't do something. I think the invitation here is to be impatient optimists with me and say, actually, we can. And I think the mindset is so important to make things happen. And if we start with an assumption something is not possible, it won't happen. Luckily, we have great examples where actually these partnerships do work and the independence is there with the right checks and balances, leadership, and funding distribution. So I think the real opportunity is for you to continue to, what in the ancient Sanskrit texts would say, be the truth warriors, to hold the mirror up to industry, to keep reminding all of us why we do what we do and the importance of getting it right for that patient that's long suffering. You know, how many of our diseases in the cancer world in emerging markets, 70%, could be addressed with existing drugs. Let's focus on that and come together and really address these pressing issues of the day. I thank you very much.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, can you go back to the live polling? And I want to know what you think now. Debate one.
The check's
Agree
in the
or
post,
disagree?
by the way.
Oh, wow. Well done, Richard.
That's changed.
Like I said, there was a lot of money distributed before.
Independence.
Oh, it's fantastic. This is the most excitement I've had all week.
I know.
Charles, when does it settle?
You do realise this is our respective mothers voting.
Go on. Last push.
56-44. Can we have the previous slide, Charles?
So
48-52. Well done. Thank you, gentlemen. Just to conclude, I think take this conversation outside. I think
It's even, isn't it, really?
it's about there.
Generous.
It's based on today's topic. It's not all about funding. I think Richard spoke about the unconscious bias. Subhanu spoke about good leadership, good governance, ensure that power balance and, self-funding solutions are possibly something we should be, moving towards. Before we end, I want to say connect with the speakers through the Congress app, rate the sessions. There's a feedback session if you can. Do join us tomorrow for the big debate 2 titled, Should Doctors Support Their Patients' Choice to Take Alternative Medicines? I know Malaysians are looking forward to that one. Debating for Dr. Vijendra Subramaniam and against Ednin Hamza. So that's at 10 minutes to 2 p.m. tomorrow. Ladies and gentlemen, thank our speakers today, our debaters, Professor Richard Sullivan and Subhanu Saxena. Thank you very much.